The world you imagine, the one of castles and chivalry, of grand halls and whispered sonnets, is a dream painted on vellum. The reality for the vast and breathing majority was something else entirely. It was a life etched in the mud, measured in harvests, and lived under the unblinking gaze of 1,000 eyes. Forget the lonely night on his quest. True isolation was a fantasy. Your life, from your first stumbling steps to your final labored breath, was a public performance. The village, the manor, the parish, these were not merely places you lived. They were living, judging entities. Your home was a wattle and daub hut, its walls thin as parchment, its sounds carrying on the still evening air with treacherous clarity. There was no lock on your door, no concept of a room of one's own. The night was not a private space, but a communal one, filled with the sounds of a dozen families, the coughs, the murmurs, the intimate rustlings of life all pressed together. You slept in a single room with your parents, your siblings, and often the livestock, a tangle of humanity in animal heat. There was no hiding a sleepless night, a quiet sob, a whispered argument. The very architecture of existence forbade it. Your first fumbling awareness of the world was likely the sound of a neighbor retching, or the sight of your parents' silhouetted forms in the shared bed. Privacy was not a right that was infringed upon. It was a concept that had not yet been invented. The community was your shelter and your prison, its boundaries marked not by walls of stone, but by the endless, intricate web of human observation. You were never truly alone with your thoughts, for your thoughts were soon to be spoken, and your words were never yours to keep. They belonged to the collective, to be chewed over, interpreted, and disseminated like the daily bread. The path to the well was a stage. The milk-ewe was a parliament. The churchyard on a Sunday was the grand amphitheater of social audit. Every glance you cast, every word you spoke, every sigh you failed to suppress was a piece of data fed into the great grinding mill of public opinion. A young man lingering a moment too long by a certain doorway would be noted by the old widow carding wool in her window. A young woman accepting an apple from a lad, not her betrothed, would be seen by the baker's boy, who would tell his mother, who would mention it to the priest's housekeeper. Information was currency, and gossip was the market where it was traded. There were no secrets, only information that had not yet become common knowledge. This constant surveillance was the bedrock of social order. It enforced norms, punished deviance, and maintained a fragile, grinding stability. To be the subject of gossip was to feel the heat of 1,000 suns focused on your back. It could dictate your marriage prospects, your standing in the community, your very ability to trade or call upon your neighbors for help. The fear of this judgment was a more effective shackle than any iron. You learned to school your features, to measure your words, to perform your role with a dull, practiced consistency. The self was not a private garden to be tended, but a public square to be maintained. In such a world, the idea of a private romance, a secret courtship, was not just foolish. It was subversive. It was an attempt to carve out a sliver of the communal world for oneself, a treason against the collective eye. The village did not just watch. It claimed ownership over your heart, your desires, your future. Your life was not your own story. It was a paragraph in the village's endless, monotonous chronicle. And so when affection dared to sprout in this stony ground, it did not do so in moonlit gardens or secluded bowers. It was born in the only places it could, the interstitial spaces of a life lived entirely in public. The courtship of the common folk was not a thing of balconies and lute songs, but of mud, chaff, and the sour smell of fermentation. Its poetry was written not in ink, but in the fleeting, stolen moments snatched from the jaws of relentless labor. The fields were the most common chapel for these silent prayers. A boy and a girl, assigned to adjacent strips of land,
might find their hoes falling into a shared rhythm. A conversation could be had, not face to face, but shouted across the turned earth, disguised as casual banter about the weather or the quality of the soil. The wind would carry away half the words, but it would carry the tone, the willingness to engage. A shared waterskin passed between them could feel as intimate as a kiss, the cool water a sacrament. The barn, especially in the deep of winter, was another sanctuary. The air thick with the sweet, dusty scent of hay and the warm, pungent breath of the animals. It offered a semblance of warmth and, more importantly, a partial shield from the ever-watchful eyes. Here in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, a couple might find a few moments alone, their whispers masked by the rustling of straw and the lowing of the oxen. But it was a precarious privacy, always one creaking door away from being shattered by a father looking for a tool or a sibling sent to fetch more eggs. The mill was a place of congregation and noise, the great wooden gears groaning, the water wheels splashing, the miller shouting over the din. In this cacophony, a few sentences could be exchanged with a semblance of secrecy, a brush of hands as a sack of grain was passed from one to the other. These were the stages for their drama: the muddy furrows of the field, the damp, fungal darkness of the woods where they gathered kindling, the reedy bank of the river where they washed clothes. There was no glamour here, no soft focus. This was courtship conducted with dirt under the fingernails and the ever-present ache of fatigue in the muscles. A compliment was not about the beauty of her eyes, but the strength with which she swung a scythe. An expression of interest was not a sonnet, but an offer to help carry a heavy burden of firewood back to the village. The setting was not an escape from life. It was life itself, raw and unadorned. The romance was in the shared endurance, the silent acknowledgement that in a world of back-breaking toil, finding a partner was less about finding a soulmate and more about finding a fellow ox for the yoke. The moments of connection were as fragile as a spider's web, spun in the corners of a world that had no time for tenderness, and just as easily swept away. And looming over every furrow, every barn, every whispered word was a shadow far more vast and imposing than that of any lord or parent, the shadows of the church. Its presence was not confined to the stone building at the village center. It permeated the very air, a psychic weather of guilt and fear. From the moment you could understand language, you were taught that your body was a vessel of sin, your natural desires a treacherous path leading directly to the eternal fires of damnation. The priest's sermons, delivered in a language you barely understood, but whose terrifying tone was unmistakable, were a weekly inventory of your failings. Lust was not a human feeling. It was a demonic temptation. A lingering thought about a member of the opposite sex was not a flutter of the heart. It was a stain upon your immortal soul. Something to be confessed, agonized over, and punished. This created a profound and agonizing internal conflict. The biological urges of youth, powerful and insistent, ran headlong into the immovable wall of theological terror. To feel desire was to be in a state of sin. To act upon it outside the very specific, sacramentally sanctioned context of marriage was to risk everything. This was the true chaperone, more effective than any nosy aunt, the internalized voice of God's wrath. The fear was not merely of public shame, but of cosmic consequences. A drought, a blight, a stillborn child. These were not random tragedies, but potential signs of God's displeasure, perhaps triggered by the hidden sins of the villagers. Your private thoughts, you were led to believe, could bring famine upon your entire community. This burden of responsibility was crushing. It turned the simple human act of attraction into a spiritual crisis. A young man looking at a girl would not just see a pretty face. He would see a test sent by the devil, a snare for his soul. A young woman feeling a blush rise to her cheeks would not feel the thrill of being noticed, but the cold dread of having invited a sinful thought. The church's calendar, with its frequent fasts and periods of abstinence, further regimented the body, teaching it to deny its own needs. The body was the enemy, the flesh a corrupt and fallen thing to be mastered, not indulged. In this psychological landscape, any expression of affection was fraught with peril. A touch was not just a touch, it was a negotiation with eternal damnation. A stolen kiss was not a moment of passion, it was a rebellion against divine law. The path to marriage, therefore, was not just a social or economic negotiation, but a spiritual gauntlet. You had to navigate your own feelings, which you had been taught were inherently suspect, while presenting a pure and pious exterior to the world. The shadow of the pulpit fell across every budding relationship, casting the warm, human glow of affection into the cold gray light of sin. Love in such a world was not a liberation, but another form of servitude, its terms dictated by a God who seemed to watch with the same unblinking, judgmental gaze as the village itself, but with the power to condemn you not just to a life of misery, but to an eternity of fire. The ultimate destination of this constrained and watched-over dance was, of course, marriage. But to call it a union of hearts would be a profound misunderstanding. In the calculus of survival, the heart was a frivolity, an unpredictable variable that threatened to disrupt the harsh mathematics of existence. Marriage was, first and foremost, a merger of assets. It was the fundamental economic unit, a small corporate entity formed to better withstand the relentless pressure of scarcity. When two families began to speak of a match, they were not discussing compatibility of temperament or shared dreams. They were conducting a board meeting. The central, often the only item on the agenda was the dowry. For a woman, her value on the marriage market was quantified with brutal precision. It was not her wit, her kindness, or her skill at brewing ale that formed the opening bid, but the tangible goods her family could transfer to the groom's family. A dowry was not a gift, it was a settlement, a payment that sealed the contract. It could consist of a milk cow, a trio of sheep, a stack of linen, a sack of silver pennies, or for the slightly more fortunate, a small parcel of land. The negotiations were conducted with the same hard-eyed pragmatism as the sale of a pig at market. The girl's father would extol the virtues of his heifer, the fineness of his wool. The boy's father would counter, pointing out a perceived flaw, arguing for a larger portion of grain or an additional copper pot. The two young people at the center of this transaction were often present, silent witnesses to the appraisal of their own worth. They were the living, breathing vessels through which property would change hands. For a young man, his value was measured in his strength, his health, and his prospects, the land he would inherit, the craft he had mastered. A young woman from a family with a poor dowry, no matter how comely or virtuous, faced a dire future. She was a liability, a mouth to feed without an incoming asset to offset the cost. She might be pushed toward the cloister if her family could scrape together the requisite donation, or remain a spinster aunt, a dependent figure in her brother's household, a constant reminder of her family's failure to secure a good deal. The marriage itself was the culmination of this cold transaction. The wedding feast, if there was one, was less a celebration of love than a public ratification of the contract, a display of the newly combined resources of the two families. The guests were not just well-wishers, they were witnesses who could attest to the terms of the deal. The couple were now a new economic cell in the body of the community, their primary purpose to work, produce children, and add to the collective wealth and stability of the village. Affection was hoped for, perhaps in the same way one might hope for a mild winter. A pleasant bonus that would make the hard work more bearable. But it was not the point. The point was the cow, the strip of land, the security against the gnawing hunger that was never more than one bad harvest away. In this world, a man did not marry for love. He married for a plow. A woman did not marry for passion. She married for a roof. The currency of survival was the only currency that truly mattered, and love was a debt it could rarely afford to pay. Yet, humanity is a stubborn force. Even in this landscape of brutal pragmatism and suffocating surveillance, the need for connection, for a gesture that said, "I see you beyond your utility," would not be extinguished. It persisted in the smallest of gestures, in a language of affection spoken through the medium of necessity. In a world where every object had a purpose and scarcity was the default state, a gift was never just a gift. It was a sacrifice, a sharing of one's own meager resources, and therefore a profound declaration of regard. The tokens exchanged by the young were not rings of gold or lockets of silver. They were carvings, whittled from a scrap of wood during the long, dark evenings. A small bird, a spoon, a comb. The time spent carving it was time not spent resting, making it a gift of energy as much as of art. For a young man to give such a thing to a girl was to say, "I thought of you when I should have been thinking of my own weariness." A shared apple, picked from the one tree that belonged to your family and saved from your own hunger, was a testament of the highest order. A length of ribbon, purchased at great cost from a traveling peddler, represented a small fortune in saved eggs or spun thread. For a young woman to accept, it was to accept a piece of his economic vitality. These were the crumbs of affection, but in a world perpetually on the brink of famine, crumbs were everything. A young couple might sneak a handful of berries to each other, their sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter gruel of their daily existence. A young man might secretly help the family of the girl he favored with a difficult task, mending a fence, chopping an extra pile of firewood, a gift of labor that was more valuable than any trinket. These gestures were fraught with meaning and risk. To misinterpret a gift was to invite humiliation. To have a gift rejected was a devastating blow, not just to the heart, but to one's social standing. But when a gift was accepted, when a carved spoon was used at the family table, or a ribbon was woven into a braid, it was a silent, powerful pact. It was a mutual acknowledgement that amidst the grinding negotiations for livestock and land, a different, quieter transaction was taking place. It was the exchange of small pieces of their individual selves, their time, their skill, their foregone sustenance, building a fragile, private stockpile of meaning against the impersonal forces that sought to define their union. These pathetic, beautiful rituals were the true love songs of the age, sung not in rhyme but in action, a quiet rebellion of the heart against the tyranny of the ledger. And so the long watched over, guilt-shadowed, economically negotiated, and token-gifted journey reached its inevitable conclusion, the hand fasting. The wedding itself was a simple, stark affair, conducted not in the mystical gloom of the church interior, but in the public space before its door. The whole village was there, not as romantic witnesses, but as the legal and social auditors of this final binding contract. The priest would join their hands, the physical symbol of the union, and ask the rote questions. The vows were exchanged, simple promises of fidelity and shared labor, their words carrying the weight of law and sacrament. There was no kiss to seal them. The joining of hands was still enough. It was over in minutes. There was no honeymoon, no romantic flight. The celebration, such as it was, involved a modest feast where the families displayed their new alliance, and then it was over. The fantasy of a happily ever after was a luxury for troubadours and fools. The morning after the wedding, the new couple awoke to the same life they had always known, only now the struggle was shared. The shackles, once worn individually, were now linked. He rose before dawn to tend the fields that were now their fields. She built the fire and began the grueling, endless cycle of baking, brewing, spinning, and cleaning that would define her existence until death. Their home was the same cramped hut, now holding the tension of two strangers, learning to navigate a partnership that had been arranged for them. Intimacy, when it came, was often awkward, furtive, and laden with the church's teachings about the sinfulness of the flesh. Even within marriage, the primary purpose was procreation, the production of new labors for the Lord and new souls for God. Pleasure was incidental and often guilt-ridden. Their life was a relentless cycle of toil, a shared burden against the cold, the hunger, and the tax collector. Children came quickly, and with them, more mouths to feed and more bodies to crowd the single room. Love, if it grew at all, did not grow like a wild, passionate flower. It grew like a lichen on a rock, slowly, imperceptibly, a hardy organism born of shared hardship, mutual dependency, and the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small, unspoken kindnesses. A shared glance of understanding after a hard day, the silent passing of the last crust of bread, the warmth of a body against the winter chill. It was a partnership forged in the furnace of survival, a bond not of poetry and passion, but of mud and endurance. The final shackle was not the wedding itself, but the life that followed, a life of shared labor until their bodies broke, a joint struggle against a world that offered no quarter. The romance was not in the beginning, but in the enduring. It was in the quiet solidarity of two people, yoked together by fate and economics, facing the long, cold, unremarkable twilight of their days, side by side, until the earth finally claimed them. This shared struggle, this slow growth of lichen on stone affection, was the true tapestry of their lives, woven on a loom of relentless routine. The seasons did not mark the passage of years in a romantic sense, but rather the repetition of identical tasks. Spring was not for lovers' walks, but for the back-breaking labor of turning the cold, heavy soil, the man guiding the plow, the woman following behind, breaking clods with a hoe. Their communication was often wordless, a series of grunts and gestures born of exhaustion and mutual understanding. The summer sun beat down not on idyllic picnics, but on bent backs in the grain fields, the sweat stinging their eyes, the fear of a hailstorm, a constant low hum of anxiety in the back of their minds. They would work until their muscles screamed and their minds were numb, collapsing at day's end into a sleep so deep it was like a little death. Autumn was a frantic race against decay, a time of harvesting, preserving, and slaughtering. The air thick with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood from the animals that would not be kept through the winter. The woman's hands, already rough, became cracked and raw from salting meat, grinding grain, and storing root vegetables in the cold and dark pit. The man's world shrank to the woodpile, a mountain of logs that represented their only defense against the coming cold. And then winter descended, not as a picturesque blanket of snow, but as a siege. The world outside their hut vanished into a white silence, broken only by the howling wind that sought out every crack and crevice. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the central fire, stinging their eyes and coating their lungs. They were prisoners in their own home, the boundaries of their world reduced to a few feet of packed earth. It was in this enforced proximity that the true character of their marriage was revealed. In the long, dark evenings, there was nothing to do but work at small tasks, mending tools, spinning wool, carving, and talk or sit in a silence that could be either comfortable or fraught with tension. This was when small irritations could fester into deep resentments. The way he chewed his food, the sound of her breathing, a forgotten chore, these tiny things could grow into monstrous grievances in the confined space. But it was also in this close quarters that the quiet solidarity could deepen. A shared glance of amusement at a child's foolishness, the unconscious way they would sit close together for warmth, the simple act of one taking over a tedious task from the other without being asked. These were the moments where the economic merger began to transform, however slightly, into something resembling a partnership. They were two trees grown so close together that their roots had become intertwined, not out of choice, but necessity. And in that intertwining, they found a strength to withstand the storms that would have toppled them individually. The children that came, often yearly, were both a blessing and a burden. A new mouth to feed was a terror, another draw on their scant resources. Infant mortality was a shadow that hung over every birth, a common grief that was so expected it was met not with dramatic lamentation, but with a grim, resigned sigh. A child that lived to its 5th year was a victory, a new pair of hands that would soon contribute to the household economy. There was little time for coddling or sentimentality. Children were put to work as soon as they could walk, scaring birds from the fields, gathering kindling, minding younger siblings. Parental love was expressed not through hugs and kisses, but through the provision of food and the teaching of survival skills. A father taught his son to wield a scythe not out of a desire for bonding, but because the family's survival depended on it. A mother taught her daughter to spin and weave not to pass on a craft, but to ensure she would be a valuable asset in her future marriage negotiations. The family was, above all, a production unit. The emotional landscape was flat, austere. Great joy was as rare as great tragedy. Both were luxuries that the rhythm of survival could not afford. Celebrations were tied to the church calendar, Christmas, Easter, and even these were brief respites, moments of slightly better food and a temporary suspension of labor before the relentless cycle began again. There was no time for self-reflection, for wondering about one's purpose or happiness. Such concepts were the indulgences of monks and nobles. Your purpose was to work, to pray, to produce children, and to die. Your happiness was a full belly on a rare feast day, a warm bed on a cold night, the survival of your family through another winter. This was the horizon of their hopes. Anything beyond it was not just unattainable, it was unimaginable. The world outside the village was a place of rumor and danger. Traveling peddlers and pilgrims brought news of distant wars, of plagues, of the whims of a king they would never see. These stories were like tales from another planet, both terrifying and fascinating. Their own lord was a distant, godlike figure, his demands delivered through his bailiff, a man more real and more feared than any monarch. The Lord's manor was the center of their universe, its fields the ones they worked, its court the one where their disputes were settled, its dungeon the place where they might end their days for poaching a rabbit or showing disrespect. Their identity was not that of an Englishman or a Frenchman, but of being from this specific village, bound to this specific strip of land. The idea of moving away, of seeking one's fortune, was not an adventure. It was a sentence of starvation. You were born, you lived, and you died on the same few acres of earth, your life barely making a dent in the endless history of the place. Your name would be forgotten within 2 generations. Your house reclaimed by the earth. Your story subsumed into the collective story of the village. This profound rootedness created a deep, almost mystical connection to the land, but it was a connection of subjugation. The land owned you, not the other way around. You knew every dip and hillock, the quality of the soil in each field, the exact spot where the best mushrooms grew. But this knowledge was a servitude. You belonged to the land as surely as the oxen did, and through it all, the village watched. It watched as the young couple, once the subject of gossip during their awkward courtship, settled into the anonymous grind of adulthood. They were no longer interesting. They were just another cell in the organism, doing their part. Their love, such as it was, became as unremarkable and as essential as the stone foundation of the church. It was not celebrated, but it was relied upon. A stable marriage meant a stable household, which meant a stable village. Their private contentment, their quiet, grinding solidarity, was a public good. The community had a vested interest in the success of their union, for a failed marriage, marked by violence, neglect, or scandal, was a disruption to the social order. The same neighbors who had once gossiped about their courtship would now intervene if a husband was too brutal or a wife too slovenly. Not out of compassion, but out of a need to maintain the functional integrity of the whole. The couple in turn learned to present a united front to the world. Their disagreements, their moments of despair, were kept behind the thin walls of their hut, swallowed down with the bland porridge of their daily existence. The public face was one of stoic endurance. They walked to church together. They worked their land together. They grew old together, their bodies becoming bent and gnarled mirror images of one another, shaped by the same forces of wind and labor. The youthful hope that might have flickered during those stolen moments in the barn was long gone, replaced by a weary, pragmatic acceptance. The dream of something more, of a life not dictated by the sun and the soil, was a childish fantasy that had been leached out of them by years of toil. They were part of the land, and the land was eternal in its demands. And yet, within this crushing framework, the human spirit still sought its own peculiar, small forms of beauty and expression. The woman might, on a rare afternoon when her chores were done, pluck a few wildflowers and place them in a cracked pot on the windowsill, a tiny, defiant gesture of aesthetics in a world of pure utility. The man might carve an intricate design into the handle of his axe, a personal signature on a tool that was an extension of his own body. The songs they sang while working were not songs of joy, but slow, mournful melodies that spoke of loss and longing. Their very sadness a comfort because it gave a voice to their unspoken hardships. The stories they told their children by the fire were not of knights and princesses, but of local spirits and ghosts, of the clever peasant who outwitted the greedy lord. Tales that allowed them to safely explore their frustrations and their hopes within a mythical framework. Their faith, for all its terror, also provided moments of sublime release. The chanting in the church, the smell of incense, the ritual of the Mass, these were moments where they could transcend their individual suffering and become part of something larger, something ordered and beautiful, even if they understood little of its Latin meaning. The pilgrimage to a local saint's shrine, undertaken perhaps to pray for a sick child, was a monumental event, a break in the routine, a journey that felt like an epic adventure. In these small ways, they carved out pockets of meaning. The affection between the husband and wife, now in their middle years, was rarely spoken. It was in the way she would automatically hand him the less weathered cloak when it was raining, or the way he would save her the softest part of the bread. It was in the silent understanding that passed between them when one of their children fell ill, a shared fear that needed no words. It was a bond forged not in the fire of passion, but in the slow, steady pressure of shared hardship, like a diamond forming in the earth's crust. It was less a feeling and more a fact of their existence, as undeniable as the sunrise. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, sick, terrified, exhausted, grieving. They had seen each other's bodies age and weaken. There were no illusions left. The young girl he had courted in the fields was now a woman with graying hair and a permanently stooped posture. The strong youth who had whittled her a spoon was now a man with a chronic cough and a limp from a long-ago accident. But in each other's eyes, they were not these diminished figures. They were the living record of a shared life, a map of every hardship endured and survived. He was the one who had been there during the great frost, when they had burned the stool to keep the baby from freezing. She was the one who had nursed him through the bloody flux when he had been certain he would die. Their history was a locked chest to which only they held the key, filled not with gold, but with a million insignificant moments that, together, added up to a life. This was the final quiet triumph of their union. The village might have arranged their marriage, the church might have sanctioned it, and economics might have necessitated it. But over the decades, they had, in their own silent, stubborn way, made it. They had taken the cold transaction and, through sheer endurance, warmed it with the heat of their shared existence. It was not the love of poetry, but it was a love nonetheless. A love built on a foundation of mud and memory, as enduring and as unremarkable as the earth itself. As the years stretched on, their world continued its immutable cycle. New children were born, old people died. The couple themselves gradually shifted from being the subjects of gossip to being the sources of it, their own eyes joining the thousand others that watched the younger generation repeat the same ancient dance of constrained courtship and economic marriage. They became pillars of the community not through any great deed, but simply by having endured. Their advice was sought not because they were wise in the ways of the world, but because they were wise in the ways of the village, its rhythms, its secrets, its unspoken rules. They had learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer help and when to turn a blind eye. The fiery passions of youth had cooled into the embers of a deep, abiding loyalty. Their conversations were now less about dreams and more about practicalities. The best time to plant the beans, the concerning cough of a granddaughter, the deteriorating thatch on their roof. The tokens of affection became even more practical, yet carried a deeper weight. He would, without a word, take over the heavy churning of the butter from her when her arthritis was bad. She would secretly mend his only good tunic by the light of the fire after he had fallen asleep. The world outside began to feel increasingly distant and strange. Their own children, raised in the same village, seemed different, their attitudes subtly shaped by whispers of change coming from the towns and cities. But for this couple, change was an abstract concept. Their reality was the land, the weather, the church, and each other. The great events of history, the battles for a throne, the pronouncements of a pope, were like thunderstorms on the horizon, audible but distant, unable to truly affect the fundamental facts of their existence. Birth, work, prayer, death. The final chapter of their story was as undramatic as the rest of it. One of them would sicken, perhaps from a winter chill that settled deep in the lungs, or from a lifetime of labor that simply wore the body out. There was no doctor, only village remedies and prayers. The end would come in the same room where their life together had begun, surrounded by the same smells of smoke and earth. The surviving partner would be left alone, a sudden, shocking silence where there had once been a constant presence. The village would rally, of course. Children would take them in, or neighbors would ensure they had food and firewood. But a fundamental part of their world had vanished. They were now an isolated tree, the one they had grown next to for decades suddenly gone, leaving them exposed to the wind. They would live out their remaining days as a relic, a living memory of a shared life that no one else fully remembered. Their thoughts would often turn inward, to the past, to the face of the young man or woman they had married a lifetime ago, to the sound of a voice that was now only an echo in their mind. The love they had built, so quiet and so strong, was now entirely their own, a treasure they carried alone until they too were released from the struggle. And when they were gone, they were buried in the churchyard, under a simple stone, if the family could afford it, or in an unmarked grave if not. Their names would fade from memory, their hut would be given to another young couple starting the same cycle, and the village would go on, its thousand eyes watching the next generation, its endless chronicle continuing, unchanged and unchangeable, under the vast, indifferent sky. This anonymity in death was the final, fitting seal on a life of collective obligation. The individual was a temporary vessel for the community's continuity, and once that vessel broke, its essence was poured back into the whole. There were no grand elegies, no carved epitaphs celebrating a unique spirit. If you were remembered at all, it was as Old John, who had the strong-backed mare, or Maggie, who never lost a child to the summer fever. Your identity was reduced to a single, useful attribute, a footnote in the village's practical memory. This was not seen as a tragedy, but as the natural order. To desire more was a form of vanity, a sin against the humble station God had assigned you. The priest spoke of the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting, but these were cosmic concepts, too vast to truly comprehend. The more immediate afterlife was the memory of your labor, the field you had cleared, the son you had raised to take your place, the daughter you had successfully married into a family with a good well. Your legacy was not your name, but your contribution to the enduring rhythm of the place. This perspective bred a profound, if grim, form of equality. The Lord in his manner would also die, and though he might be buried inside the church under a slab of marble, his body would rot just the same, and his name would eventually be forgotten by all but the pedantic monks who kept the genealogy. The peasant and the Lord were united in their ultimate return to the earth, one just a little sooner and with less ceremony than the other. This understanding permeated daily life, muting both ambition and despair. Why strive for greatness when your fate was the same as everyone else's? Why succumb to utter hopelessness when your small, anonymous life was part of a pattern as old as creation? Your suffering was not personal, it was the human condition. This stoic acceptance was the bedrock of their resilience. They endured because there was no alternative, and they found a strange comfort in the very inevitability of their obscurity. The church, while offering the hope of a glorious afterlife, also reinforced this world's rigid hierarchy. Its stone structure physically dominated the village, its bell dictating the tempo of life, from the Angelus at dawn to the curfew at dusk. Its teachings were not just about salvation, they were a comprehensive manual for social control. The doctrine of the three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, was presented as a divine, unchangeable order. To challenge your place was to challenge God's will. The sermons, delivered in a sonorous Latin that few understood, were then translated by the priest into simple, terrifying admonishments. Obey your master, pay your tithes. Do not covet your neighbor's wife or his possessions, for such sins endanger not only your soul, but the entire community. The village's watchfulness was thus sanctified. To police your neighbor's behavior was a holy duty, a way to maintain the purity of the body of Christ, which was the community itself. Sin was not a private matter between a person and God. It was a communal infection. A hidden act of adultery could be the reason God withheld the rain. A family's greed in hoarding grain could be why the plague visited. This collective responsibility created a society of immense social pressure, where conformity was enforced as much by fear of divine retribution as by fear of gossip. The church's calendar provided the only relief from this grind, the feast days acting as sanctioned releases of pressure. On these days, the normal rules were temporarily suspended. There was dancing, however clumsy, there was singing, however rough, and there was ale, however weak. These brief explosions of merriment were vital safety valves, allowing for the expression of joys and frustrations that had no other outlet. But even these celebrations were communal and watched. A man who drank too much and revealed a hidden resentment would be remembered and judged long after his headache faded. A woman who danced too freely with a man not her husband would find herself the subject of pointed prayers for the following week. The church, therefore, was not just a building or a set of beliefs. It was the ultimate chaperone, its shadow stretching not only over the physical spaces of the village, but deep into the psychological landscape of every soul, shaping desire into guilt, individuality into sin, and life itself into a long penance for a debt they were born owing. The material world of the peasant was one of relentless scarcity, and this scarcity defined every human relationship. A dowry was not merely a custom, it was a critical risk management strategy. In a world without banks or social safety nets, a family's survival depended on the strategic dispersal of its assets. Marrying a daughter without a dowry was not just a social failure, it was an economic one. You were essentially gifting a mouth to feed to another family without compensation, weakening your own household's reserves. The negotiations were thus conducted with a seriousness that could mean the difference between life and death in a lean year. The young couple's feelings were the least important variable in this equation. In fact, strong personal attachment could be a liability, as it might lead to rash decisions that disrupted carefully laid plans. The ideal match was one that balanced the ledgers of both families. A young man known for his strength and diligence was a good investment, akin to acquiring a reliable piece of equipment. A young woman known for her skill at brewing, weaving, or animal husbandry brought a productive capacity to the new household that was often more valuable than her dowry and coin. The marriage contract was, in essence, a merger designed to create a more resilient economic unit. The wedding itself was the signing of this contract. The exchange of vows at the church door was a public legal proceeding, and the feasting afterwards was less a celebration of romance than a display of the new alliance's combined resources. The community witnessed not only the union of two people, but the union of two family economies. The gifts given were typically practical: a kettle, a blanket, a side of bacon, things that contributed to the establishment of the new household. The pressure on the new couple was immense from the very start. They were not playing at house, they were launching a small, vulnerable enterprise in a hostile economic climate. Their success or failure would be visible to all in the quality of their hut, the health of their animals, and the fullness of their bellies. The first years of marriage were a brutal probationary period, scrutinized by the entire village. Failure to prosper could be attributed to laziness, incompetence, or worse, God's disfavor, further isolating them. This constant pressure forged marriages that were, above all, practical partnerships. Affection was a welcome but secondary benefit. The primary goal was successful joint production. Within this rigid framework, the language of love adapted to the grammar of survival. The tokens of affection were by necessity humble, but their simplicity belied their profound significance. In a life where every resource was allocated, to give something away was a true sacrifice. A young man might spend weeks carving a single wooden comb, his knuckles raw from the effort, his limited free time entirely devoted to the task. The comb was not just an object. It was a physical manifestation of his time, his patience, and his focus, all precious commodities. For the young woman who received it, its value was incalculable. Every time she used it, she was touched by his sacrifice. A shared apple, saved from one's own hunger, was a more powerful declaration than a sonnet. It said, "I will go without so that you may have." These gestures created a private economy of sentiment, a secret ledger of mutual gifts that existed parallel to the official, harsh economy of dowries and land deals. This private exchange was their first true collaboration, a tiny fledgling entity they built together, hidden from the watching eyes of the village. It was the foundation upon which any deeper connection would be built. The risks were real. A gift that was too elaborate might be seen as presumptuous or might raise suspicions among families. A gift that was rejected was a devastating repudiation, not just of romantic interest, but of the very sacrifice it represented. The careful, cautious exchange of these crumbs of affection was a delicate dance, a way of testing the waters of a potential partnership while still operating within the strict confines of their world. It was in these small, unobserved transactions that they exercised what little free will they possessed, choosing to invest a piece of themselves in another person, hoping for a return that was measured not in grain or coin, but in reciprocal care. The conclusion of this long process, the hand fasting, was therefore an anticlimax. It was the bureaucratic endpoint of a journey that had been mapped out by others, the final locking of a door they had never truly held the key to. The romance, to the extent it existed, had already happened in the stolen moments, in small sacrifices. The wedding day itself was a formality, a public ratification of a decision made in counting houses and across kitchen tables. The couple stood before the priest, their hands bound together, symbols of the bond that now legally and spiritually chained them. There was no honeymoon, no romantic voyage. The transition from betrothed to married was instantaneous and total. They went to bed as two individuals bound by a promise and woke up the next morning as a single economic and social entity. The struggle began immediately. The work was the same, but now the responsibility was shared. The scrutiny was the same, but now it was directed at their combined efforts. The hope for a happily ever after was a fantasy for children. The reality was the dawn of a shared labor that would only end with death. Their love, if it was to grow, would not be a passionate flame, but a slow-burning peat fire dug from the difficult ground of their shared existence, providing steady, undramatic heat against the enduring cold of their world. It would be found not in grand declarations, but in the silent mutual understanding that they were now one another's only true ally in a life of unyielding toil. This shared labor, this yoking of two lives to a single plow, created an intimacy that was as profound as it was unspoken. It was an intimacy not of whispered sweet nothings, but of shared calluses and synchronized movements. They learned to read each other's bodies with the same practiced eye they used to read their weather. He knew the meaning of the slight stoop in her shoulders by late afternoon, a sign that the pain in her back was flaring up, and would wordlessly take the full water bucket from her hands. She knew the set of his jaw when he returned from the Lord's domain, the tightness that meant he had been humiliated by the bailiff, and would silently place a cup of ale beside him before he asked. Their communication was a language of actions, not words. A touch on the arm could mean, "I am here," or "be careful," or "I understand," all depending on the context and pressure. In the crowded darkness of their hut, the rustle of straw as one turned over could be a question. "Are you awake?" And the answering sigh, a response. This physical familiarity, born of proximity and shared hardship, was the bedrock of their connection. It was stripped of the courtly idealization of the body. They knew each other's smells, the sounds of their digestions, the way they coughed in the night. There was no room for romantic illusion. This was the raw material of a human life, and in accepting it in one another, they achieved a form of grace that no troubadour's song could ever capture. The world of children was the only domain where a flicker of uncalculated joy could occasionally break through the grim pragmatism. A baby's first steps were a genuine, if brief, cause for celebration, a testament to life's stubborn persistence. Yet, even this joy was tempered by brutal reality. Half of all children died before the age of 5. The loss of a child was a common, searing pain, a wound that was expected and therefore borne with a stoic grief that was quickly buried beneath the demands of survival. There was no time for prolonged mourning. The dead were buried, often in a small, unmarked plot, and life, with its relentless needs, moved on. The children who survived were integrated into the economy of the household almost as soon as they could walk. Childhood, as a protected period of innocence and play, was a modern invention. A child was a future laborer, a future asset. Their value was practical. Boys were taught to scare crows, to tend geese, to fetch and carry, their small hands gradually trained for the heavier work of manhood. Girls shadowed their mothers, learning the endless, complex art of domestic survival. Spinning, weaving, brewing, cooking, caring for infants. Affection was shown through the transmission of this crucial knowledge. A mother patiently showing her daughter how to card wool was expressing her love by equipping her for life. A father gruffly correcting his son's grip on a scythe was preparing him to one day provide for his own family. Punishment was swift and physical, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate need to enforce discipline in a world where a single mistake, a child leaving a gate open, wandering too near the fire, could mean disaster. The emotional life of the family was therefore flat, pragmatic, and oriented entirely toward the future. Dreams were not for the children to become knights or ladies, but for them to grow strong, to marry well, and to continue the line. The cycle was everything. Within the cycle, the roles of men and women were strictly demarcated, yet their spheres were deeply interdependent. The man's world was the field, the forest, the road. His identity was tied to his physical strength, his endurance, his ability to provide and protect. His authority within the household was legally and socially absolute, but it was an authority tempered by the constant knowledge that his survival depended on his wife's labor just as much as hers depended on his. The woman's world was the house, the garden, the yard. Her domain was the transformation of raw materials into the stuff of life, grain into bread, wool into clothing, milk into cheese. Her work was never done because it was cyclical. Cooking, cleaning, and childcare were tasks that were consumed and had to be immediately begun again. Her power was subtler, but no less real. She was the manager of the household's scarce resources, the one who decided how much grain to grind, how much ale to brew, when to slaughter the chicken. A wise husband deferred to his wife's judgment in these matters, for her skill in management could mean the difference between a lean winter and a starving one. While he represented the household to the outside world, she was the engine of its internal survival. This created a balance of power, an unspoken treaty between the castle of his labor and the kingdom of hers. They were co-rulers of a tiny, impoverished state, and their success depended on a fragile, constantly negotiated alliance. The landscape itself was a character in their story, a passive-aggressive tyrant that dictated their every move. They knew the land not as a beautiful vista, but as a collection of specific, demanding personalities. This field had soil that was heavy and wet, best for rye. That one on the south-facing slope was warmer and could support barley. The woods were a source of life, firewood, mushrooms, nuts, and a place of danger, wolves, outlaws, malevolent spirits. The river was a source of water and fish, but it could also rise and wash away their meager crops. They lived by a knowledge passed down through generations, a deep, intuitive understanding of the signs of nature. The flight of birds, the color of the sunset, the behavior of animals, all were omens to be read and obeyed. Their calendar was not marked by dates but by tasks. The plowing moon, the shearing moon, the harvest moon. Time was not a straight line progressing toward a better future, but a circle, an endless wheel of repetition. This created a mindset that was deeply conservative and resistant to change. The old ways were the best ways because they were proven. A new method of planting was not progress. It was a reckless gamble with starvation. This profound connection to the land bred a kind of rooted wisdom, but it was a wisdom that looked backward, not forward. They were custodians of a tradition, not pioneers of a new world. And through it all, the community remained the ultimate arbiter, the chorus in the tragedy and comedy of their lives. Its judgment was inescapable. The practice of charivari, or rough music, was a potent example of this communal enforcement. If a couple was perceived to have violated social norms, a husband who was beaten by his wife, a wife who was unfaithful, an unpopular marriage, the villagers would gather at their door at night, banging pots and pans, shouting insults and creating a deafening cacophony. This was not mere teasing. It was a ritualized form of social censure designed to shame the offenders back into conformity. To be the target of a charivari was a deeply humiliating experience, a clear message that one had stepped outside the boundaries of accepted behavior. Conversely, the community also provided a meager safety net. In times of sickness or injury, neighbors would help with the harvest. If a house burned down, the village would contribute to rebuilding it. This was not pure altruism, it was mutual insurance. Today it was your neighbor's hut, tomorrow it could be yours. This complex interplay of judgment and support, of gossip and aid, created a social fabric that was incredibly strong and resilient, but also suffocatingly tight. There was no individual salvation, only collective fate. In the final analysis, the love that grew in this stony ground was a testament to the human capacity for connection under the most adverse conditions. It was a love that had been stripped of all romance, all fantasy, all the grand illusions that so often accompany the emotion. It was a love that knew the price of everything, the cost of a loaf of bread, the value of a healthy child, the weight of a winter's cold. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual need, but over time that need could transform into a genuine, if inarticulate, devotion. It was the love of two draft animals, yoked together for life, who have learned to lean into the collar at the same time, to bear the weight together, and to find in that shared strain a reason to keep pulling. It did not roar like a fire, it smoldered like peat, providing a steady, humble heat that kept the darkness and the cold at bay. It was the love of the lichen on the rock, a life that required no rich soil, that asked for nothing but a surface to cling to, and that, through its quiet, tenacious existence, slowly over the course of a lifetime, changed the very face of the stone dot. This transformation of the individual into a component of the collective had a profound effect on the very concept of the self. The modern idea of a rich internal life, a unique personal identity to be discovered and expressed, was an impossible luxury. The peasant's inner world was not a sprawling, uncharted territory, but a small, neatly kept plot, its boundaries strictly drawn by doctrine and custom. Their thoughts were less about, who am I, and more about, what must I do? The relentless physical labor left little energy for introspection, and the constant presence of others left little space for it. When they did have a moment of solitude, while walking a distant path to a remote field, or during the silent vigil of a winter's night, their thoughts likely did not turn to personal fulfillment, but to immediate and tangible concerns. The ache in a joint, the worry over a stored grain, the hope for a successful birth. Their identity was extrinsic, defined by their relationships and their function. John, son of William, husband of Agnes, tenant of the 3-field strip by the stream. To be stripped of these relationships, to be orphaned, widowed, or exiled, was not just a personal tragedy, it was an ontological crisis, a dissolution of the self. You were no one. This effacement of the individual was mirrored in their relationship with the divine. The God of the medieval peasant was not necessarily a personal, loving father. He was a distant, powerful lord, akin to the secular lord in his manner, but infinitely more so. His will was inscrutable, his judgment swift and often brutal. Prayers were less conversations and more petitions, akin to the way one might plead with a bailiff for a reduction in dues. The saints were spiritual intermediaries, heavenly bailiffs who could be petitioned with specific offerings for specific results. Saint Anthony for lost possessions, Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Clare for clear weather. This was a transactional relationship with the cosmos. I will give you this pledge of devotion, and you will grant me this favor. The grand narrative of sin and redemption was understood in the most local and immediate terms. A sin was a concrete action, theft, adultery, blasphemy, that disrupted the social and spiritual order and had to be corrected through penance. Salvation was a distant hope, but a good harvest, a healthy child, or a survived plague were tangible signs of divine favor. Their faith was therefore pragmatic and rooted in the material world. The beauty of the stained glass window was not for them to enjoy from the nave. It was an offering to God, a spiritual investment made by the Lord or Guild that paid for it. Their own religious expression was in the repetitive rhythm of the rosary, the physical act of genuflection, the taste of the Eucharist, rituals that affirmed their place within the great, ordered chain of being, from the lowliest worm to God himself. The concept of time itself was experienced differently. It was not a linear progression toward improvement, but a cyclical recurrence of the same. The past was not a foreign country, it was the template for the present. The wisdom of the elders was paramount because they had seen more cycles, survived more winters, and remembered the last great famine. The future was not a land of opportunity, but a mere repetition of the present, with the names changed. A son would take his father's place, a daughter her mother's. This cyclical view bred a deep-seated conservatism and a resistance to change that could seem like stupidity to an outsider, but was, in fact, a highly rational strategy for survival. Innovation was dangerous. A new farming technique might fail. A new belief might be heresy. The old ways had, at the very least, ensured survival up to this point. This is why peasant revolts, when they did occur, were rarely revolutions aiming for a new world order. They were almost always reactionary, seeking to restore perceived ancient rights and customs that a lord had recently violated. They fought not for freedom in the abstract, but for the specific right to gather firewood in a certain forest or to grind their grain at their own mill rather than the Lord's. Their horizon of hope was not liberation, but the restoration of a traditional, known yoke that was slightly less heavy. In this context, the moments of beauty and joy that did occur were all the more piercing because of their stark contrast with the prevailing grimness. The sudden, unexpected scent of a wild rose growing on the edge of a midden heap. The breathtaking clarity of a starry night, unpolluted by any artificial light. The collective, heart-lifting sound of the church bells on a major feast day, ringing across the fields. The warmth of the first sun on your face after a long winter. The taste of a wild strawberry discovered by chance. These sensations were not taken for granted. They were tiny, brilliant jewels set into the dull, gray metal of everyday life. They were felt with an intensity that modern, saturated senses can scarcely imagine. A single song learned from a traveling minstrel and passed down through generations could carry within it the accumulated longing and sorrow of 100 years. A story told and retold by the hearth was not just entertainment, it was a vessel of memory, identity, and shared values. In these simple sensory experiences, the human spirit asserted its need for more than mere survival. It was a quiet, stubborn insistence on the value of a moment of pleasure, a flash of beauty, a shared laugh in the face of the unyielding dark. And so the life of the medieval peasant was a study in profound contradictions. It was a life of immense physical strength and resilience, coupled with profound political and social powerlessness. It was a life lived in a crowded community, yet often marked by a deep, unspoken loneliness. It was a life of crushing material poverty, yet one that could find richness in the smallest of sensory gifts. Their love, their faith, their very sense of self were all shaped by the iron necessities of survival. Yet within those rigid confines, the human capacity for connection, meaning, and even joy found a way to persist. They did not build the cathedrals, but their labor funded them. They did not write the philosophies, but their lived experience was a philosophy of its own, a philosophy of endurance, of community, of finding meaning not in transcending one's station, but in fulfilling it with a quiet, unacknowledged dignity. They were the foundation upon which the glittering world of knights and kings was built, the vast, silent, anonymous ocean upon which the great ships of history sailed, their own stories sinking without a trace, yet their collective weight determining the tide of everything. They loved not as a firework display, but as the earth itself loves the sun through a patient, silent, and life-sustaining dependence that asks for nothing in return but the chance to continue. And in that continuation, in the simple, brutal, beautiful act of enduring, they found a purpose that no monument could ever capture, and a legacy that was written not in stone, but in the very land they worked, season after season, generation after generation, until they became a part of it, silent and essential as the soil dot. This dissolution of the self into the collective in the land was a process that began in childhood and culminated in a death that was as unceremonious as the life that preceded it. There were no deathbed confessions of long-held dreams or reconciliations of secret passions. The end, when it came, was typically a physical surrender to a lifetime of wear. The body, worn out like a tool that had been used for too many seasons, simply stopped. The lungs, scarred by years of smoke and damp, gave out. The heart, strained by relentless labor, faltered. Or more dramatically, an accident, a fall from a roof, a kick from a horse, a cut that festered, swiftly concluded a story that had been one long, slow diminishment. The rituals surrounding death were communal and practical, reflecting the same ethos that governed life. The body was washed by the women of the village, often the same neighbors who had helped bring new life into the world. The laying out was brief. In a world without embalming, decay was swift and undeniable. The wake was a vigil, a final act of community watchfulness, ensuring the deceased was not alone on their journey and that evil spirits were kept at bay. The funeral itself was a stark affair. The bell tolled, not with a personalized melody, but with the same monotonous clang that marked all deaths, a sound that reminded everyone of their own inevitable summons. The procession to the churchyard was a public affirmation of the community's continuity. The corpse, sewn into a simple shroud, was a stark reminder of the equality of all flesh before God and the worms. Burial was in consecrated ground, but the grave was seldom marked with more than a simple wooden cross, if that. The plot would be reused in a generation or two, the bones disinterred and placed in an ossuary to make room for the newly dead. This was the final physical expression of anonymity. You returned to the earth, and your mortal remains were literally recycled to make space for the next in line. Your memory lived only as long as the oldest person who had known you. And even then, you were remembered not for your essence, but for your function. He was a good thatcher. She never complained. These were the highest epitaphs one could hope for. The individual was a single thread in a tapestry that was constantly being rewoven, its pattern unchanging, the loss of one thread barely noticeable in the grand design. And yet, to conclude that this life was without meaning or that their love was without depth would be to misunderstand it completely. Theirs was a different scale of values, one where meaning was found not in self-actualization, but in successful integration. A life was good if it was lived in accordance with the rules of God and community, if it produced children who survived, and if it ended without having brought shame or disaster upon the household. Happiness was not a pursued state, but a fleeting byproduct of a rare alignment of circumstances. A good harvest, a healthy family, a warm fire on a cold night. The love between a man and a woman was not measured in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in the sheer, unbroken duration of their partnership. It was a love proven not by intensity, but by endurance. It was the love of the stone that withstands the river, not the love of the flash flood that reshapes the landscape. It was, in its own way, a monumental achievement. To have shared a life, a bed, a table, and a destiny for 40 years. To have faced down famine, disease, and despair together without breaking the bond was a triumph of the human spirit as significant as any artistic masterpiece or military victory. It was a triumph that went unrecorded, uncelebrated, and utterly unnoticed by history. But it was the bedrock upon which history was built. The world we have lost is not one of romantic chivalry or pious simplicity. It is the world of these people, a world of immense constraint where the human spirit was forced to find its expression within the narrowest of confines. Their legacy is not in castles or cathedrals, but in the very fact of our existence. We are here because they endured. We are here because they submitted to marriages they did not choose, performed labor that broke their bodies, and lived lives of profound obscurity, all the while maintaining the fragile threads of family and community that stretched across the generations. Their love story is the story of the human race itself, a story not of soaring passion, but of stubborn persistence. It is the story of the seed that grows in cracked earth, the story of the root that slowly, imperceptibly splits the stone. It is a story that does not end with a dramatic climax, but simply continues. In the silence after the church bell has faded, in the slow settling of the earth over a forgotten grave, in the turning of the seasons over a field that has seen 1,000 such lives come and go, their story whispers the only truth that ultimately mattered. We were here. We worked. We endured. We are gone. And the world, for a little while, was different because we, together, bore its weight. This enduring, this silent bearing of the world's weight was not a passive state, but an active, continuous choice made every sunrise, with every swing of the axe or turn of the spinning wheel. It was a choice made not in the mind, but in the muscles and the bones. It was a covenant with the land itself, a vow whispered not to God or to each other, but to the very act of continuation. In this, their lives achieved a kind of grim, monumental poetry. The chronicles of kings are filled with dates and battles, the names of vanquished foes and conquered territories. But the chronicle of the peasant is written in the slow, patient language of geology. It is the story of a field that was cleared of stones, generation after generation, until it could finally be plowed deeply. It is the story of a footpath worn inches below the surrounding turf by 10,000 repetitions of the same journey. It is the story of a hearth whose smoke-blackened stones hold the residue of a century of fires, each one lit by hands that knew the same motions, the same hopes for warmth, the same fears for the coming night. Their understanding of the world was not derived from books or sermons alone, but from this intimate physical dialogue with their environment. They knew the world was round not because a scholar told them, but because they watched his ship disappear hull first over the horizon of the sea, or saw the curved shadow of the earth on the moon during an eclipse. They understood the passage of time not as abstract hours, but as the length of a shadow cast by a certain tree, or the specific angle of the sunlight as it fell through the smoke hole of their hut. Their science was one of observation and pattern recognition, honed to a fine edge by necessity. They could predict the weather by the ache in a grandfather's knee, or the particular flight of swallows. They knew the properties of herbs not from a herbalist manual, but from the remembered lore of a grandmother's hands, which poultice could draw out infection, which tea could ease a feverish child into sleep. This was a knowledge that was felt in the body, a deep, intuitive wisdom that was as reliable as it was unrecorded. Within the stark confines of their roles, they also developed a rich, subterranean world of humor and satire. Their laughter was a weapon against the oppressive weight of their reality. It was often dark, gallows humor, directed at the foolishness of their betters, the miserliness of a neighbor, or the universal absurdities of the human condition, including their own. The village idiot, the cuckolded husband, the scolding wife. These were stock characters in an endless, informal comedy performed in the fields and around the fire. This laughter was a vital pressure valve, a way of asserting a shred of control through mockery. By laughing at the Lord's pretensions or the priest's hypocrisy, they momentarily inverted the social order, reducing the powerful to figures of fun in their own minds. It was a small, safe rebellion, but a rebellion nonetheless. Their songs, too, were often laced with double meanings and thinly veiled critiques, their rough melodies carrying subversive thoughts that could never be spoken aloud in the light of day. The concept of beauty for them was inextricably linked to utility and order. A well-made tool was a beautiful thing, a scythe with a perfect balance, a pottery jug that held water without weeping, a tightly woven basket that could carry a heavy load. The beauty of a sunset was appreciated not just for its colors, but because it promised a fair day for the harvest on the morrow. The symmetry of a plowed field was not an abstract aesthetic. It was the visible proof of a job well done, a satisfying order imposed upon chaos. Their own personal adornment was minimal and almost always functional. A leather thong to tie back hair, a clasp that held a cloak shut against the wind, a carved wooden pin. Any deviation from this, any attempt at purely decorative display, was viewed with suspicion, as it implied a vanity that was at odds with the communal value of humility and the constant press of necessary work. In the end, the greatest testament to their inner lives may lie in the very silence that surrounds them in the historical record. That silence is not empty. It is a pregnant silence filled not with nothingness, but with everything that was too ordinary, too universal, too deeply felt to be written down. It is the silence of a million unspoken prayers over a child's feverish brow. It is the silence of a hand squeezed in the dark during a thunderstorm. It is the silence of two people sitting side by side on a tree stump at the end of the day, watching the stars emerge, their shared weariness a language more eloquent than words. We, with our documented feelings and our curated lives, have perhaps lost the capacity to understand the profound depths that can exist within such quietude. Their love, their faith, their entire worldview was a testament to the idea that meaning is not something that is found or created, but something that is built, like a wall, one heavy, undramatic stone at a time. It is built through the daily, unheroic acts of showing up, of doing the work, of bearing the burden. The grand narrative of history is a symphony with its crashing crescendos and soaring melodies, the battles, the coronations, the revolutions. But beneath it, providing the fundamental rhythm upon which the melody depends, is the bass note of this enduring love, this steadfast labor. It is a drone, constant and unchanging, the sound of the loom, the sound of the plow in the earth, the sound of a heart beating in the dark. It is not a glamorous sound, but without it, the symphony would have no foundation, no context, no meaning. It is the sound of the world turning, and it is the sound of a love that asked for nothing, and in doing so encompassed everything that truly mattered. The stubborn, beautiful, and ultimately victorious will to endure together until the very end of days. And so their story does not conclude, but simply becomes one with the landscape, a whisper in the wind that says, "We are still here, in the soil you walk on, in the food you eat, in the simple, stubborn fact of your own existence. Remember us not for what we achieved, but for what we bore. For in that bearing we built the world dot." To understand them fully, one must also consider the sounds and silences that shape their inner world. We live in an age of constant auditory stimulation, a barrage of manufactured noise. Their world was dominated by the natural and the necessary. The day began not with an alarm, but with the crow of a rooster, a sound that was both timekeeper and taskmaster. The soundtrack of their lives was the rhythmic scratch of the quern as grain was ground into flour, the steady thud of the loom's batten, the suck and pull of the mud under their boots in a wet field, the distant, reassuring lowing of cattle. At night, the silence was profound, broken only by the call of an owl, the rustle of a hedgehog in the undergrowth, or the cough of a neighbor from a nearby hut. This oral landscape was not mere background noise. It was a constant source of information and meaning. A change in the wind's tone could signal a coming storm. The particular cry of a fox could mean it had found the chickens. The absence of a familiar sound, the forge's hammer for instance, could indicate illness or misfortune. In this world, listening was as crucial a survival skill as seeing. Their inner monologue, what little of it was not consumed by the sheer effort of doing, was likely punctuated and shaped by these external sounds, their thoughts rising and falling with the rhythms of their labor and the land. This deep immersion in the sensory and the practical bred a unique form of imagination, one that was concrete and animistic. The world was not a collection of inanimate objects operating under impersonal laws of physics. It was alive with intention and spirit. The ancient oak at the edge of the field was not just a tree, it was a presence, a witness, a being that might harbor goodwill or malice. The stream that watered their fields had a spirit that could be thanked or offended. This belief was a layer beneath the veneer of Christianity, a folk memory that colored their perception of the divine. God and the saints ruled in heaven, but the local spirits, the genie loci, governed the immediate tangible world. A prayer to St. Catherine for a safe childbirth was official doctrine. Leaving a bowl of milk out for the house brownie was practical insurance. This was not seen as heresy, but as common sense. The world was enchanted, and every rock, tree, and spring was a potential portal to the unseen. This animism made the world a more fearful place, but also a more intimate one. They were not masters of their environment, but participants in a vast, living community that included the human, the animal, the vegetable, and the spiritual. A failure of the crops could be as much about offending the spirit of the field as it was about bad weather or poor soil. Within the crushing conformity, there were still subtle hierarchies and intricate social dances. The village was not a homogeneous mass of equals. The family that held the lease to the mill held a different status from the family that worked only a half virgate of land. The blacksmith, with his specialized, indispensable knowledge, commanded a respect different from that given to a common farmhand. The old widow, who was a renowned healer, the cunning woman, occupied an ambiguous but powerful position, feared and sought after in equal measure. These micro-hierarchies were negotiated and maintained through a complex economy of favors, slights, and reciprocities. The gift of a particularly fine cut of meat after a slaughter, the lending of a son for a day's heavy labor, the sharing of a rare treat like honey, these were not just acts of kindness. They were social transactions that reinforced bonds, settled debts, and acknowledged status. To refuse a request for help was not just unneighborly, it was a rupture in the social fabric that could have consequences for years. The entire community functioned like a single, sprawling organism, each cell dependent on the others, each action rippling through the whole. The body itself was viewed through a lens utterly foreign to our modern sensibilities. It was not a temple, but a fragile, leaky, and often treacherous vessel. It was subject to humors that could fall out of balance, to miasmas that rose from foul air and water, to the influence of the planets. Pain was a constant companion, and the threshold for what constituted a malady was incredibly high. A chronic cough, a bad back, rotting teeth, these were not reasons to seek help, but simply the expected conditions of a life of labor. The body's functions were not hidden away with shame, but were a matter of public fact. Everyone knew who suffered from the flux, whose wife was with child, which old man was losing his wits. The boundaries between the self and the community were porous, and this included the physical self. The body and its frailty and its functions was just another piece of the collective reality, to be endured, managed, and eventually surrendered. And so, when we try to envision the inner world of the medieval peasant, we must imagine a consciousness that is profoundly externalized. Their sense of self was not built on a foundation of internal reflection and personal ambition, but was woven from the external threads of their relationships, their labor, their place in the landscape, and their role in the community. Their mind was a map of practical knowledge, of people, of places, of tasks, of signs and portents. Their heart was an instrument calibrated not for the high notes of romantic passion, but for the steady, low hum of loyalty, dependency, and shared endurance. Their love was the love of the vine for the wall it clings to, not the love of two stars colliding in the void. It was a force of nature, patient, tenacious, and ultimately life-giving. It asked for no witness other than the changing seasons, no monument other than the continued existence of the family in the field. It was a love that knew its place in the great, grim, beautiful, and unending chain of being, and in that knowing found a purpose so complete, so total that it needed no name. It was simply the way of the world, and in the end, for them, that was enough. It had to be this externalized consciousness, this self that was a reflection of its world rather than a rebellion against it, found its ultimate expression in the concept of fate, or weird as their Germanic ancestors might have called it. This was not a passive fatalism, but a profound acknowledgement that their lives were swept along by currents far larger than any individual will. A personal dream, a private ambition, was like a single raindrop hoping to change the course of a river. The river was the lineage, the village, the harvest, the will of God. To fight against it was not just futile, it was a form of madness. This acceptance was the source of both their profound resilience and their profound stasis. It allowed them to endure catastrophes that would break a modern individual, famine, pestilence, the loss of children, without complete psychological dissolution. The grief was real and searing, but it was a grief that was expected, a part of the contract of life. It did not lead to an existential crisis about the meaning of it all, because the meaning was preordained and collective. To play your part, to bear your cross, to contribute to the whole. Their personal story was a single brief verse in an epic poem that had been recited long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. This worldview permeated their very language and expression. The stories they told were not about individuals who changed their destiny through force of will. Their folk tales were about cunning peasants who used their wits to momentarily get the better of a greedy lord or a cruel abbot, a temporary carnivalesque inversion of the hierarchy that always ended with the order restored. Their heroes were not rebels, but survivors. The greatest compliment was to be called steadfast, reliable, hardworking. Their love, therefore, was a steadfast love. It was not chosen in a moment of passionate abandon, but accumulated like layers of sediment through countless small acts of mutual reliance. It was the knowledge that in a world of uncertainty, there was one person whose loyalty was as dependable as the rising sun. Not because of intense feeling, but because your fates were literally bound together. Your survival was their survival, and vice versa. This created a bond that, while lacking the fireworks of romantic idealization, possessed the tensile strength of forged iron. The physical space they inhabited reinforced this reality. The medieval village was not a picturesque collection of cottages, but a functional, organic cluster of life, bounded by the tangible and the symbolic. The churchyard wall marked the boundary between the community of the living and the community of the dead, who were still considered part of the parish. The cross at the crossroads was not just a religious symbol, it was a psychic landmark, a place of power and protection against the spirits that were believed to linger where paths converged. The village green was the lung and the living room of the community, the stage for its public life. There were no private gardens, no spaces for solitary contemplation. Every inch of land had a purpose, and every purpose was communal. This lack of physical privacy was not a deprivation they felt, because the concept of a private life separate from the communal one was as alien to them as space travel. The self was a public entity. Your joys were public, your shames were public, your labor was public, your death was public. In this context, the final act of their love story was not a dramatic deathbed scene, but a slow, mutual unraveling. As age took its toll, their roles shifted yet again. The man, no longer able to wield a scythe, might take on the lighter tasks of tool mending or watching grandchildren. The woman, her eyesight failing, might be reduced to the simplest chores of sorting grains by touch. Their world, once bounded by the horizons of their labor, would shrink to the confines of their hut in the churchyard. Their conversations would become repetitions of old stories, their memories a shared country they could visit together. The passion of youth, if it had ever existed in a recognizable form, was long since transformed into something else. A deep, worn comfort, like two old stones that have leaned against each other for so long that they now share a single, stable center of gravity. The love between them was no longer a feeling between two distinct individuals, but the very atmosphere they breathed, the accumulated history of a life built in common. It was the silence that fell between them when they sat together, a silence that was not empty, but full of the echoes of all the words they had ever spoken and all the struggles they had ever shared. When death finally came for one, it was not just the end of a person, it was the tearing of a fabric. For the survivor, it was a catastrophic amputation. Half of their shared memory was gone. Half of their understanding of the world vanished. The familiar routines of their life were shattered. The hut, once a space of shared purpose, became a cavern of absence. The survivor was now a ghost in the community, a living reminder of a broken whole. They were cared for, but they were no longer a complete social unit. They had become a dependent, a fragment. Their own identity, so deeply intertwined with another's, was now horribly, painfully incomplete. They would live out their days as a testament to the very bond that had just been severed, a walking monument to a love that had been so fundamental it was like the earth underfoot, noticeable only in its catastrophic absence. And so the story of their love does not end with the closing of the curtain. It simply dissipates like mist over the fields at dawn. It returns to the soil, to the collective memory of the village that quickly forgets the particularities of the two individuals. But the pattern they lived, the love they built, does not die. It is inherited. It is passed down not through words, but through example. Their children who witnessed this daily, grinding, steadfast partnership would unconsciously replicate its rhythms. They would seek not passion, but reliability. They would build not on a foundation of starry-eyed romance, but on the bedrock of shared purpose and mutual need. The legacy of that medieval couple is not a love letter tucked away in a drawer, but the unspoken, inherited understanding that love is not a feeling that conquers all, but a practice that endures all. It is the daily, unheroic, and utterly essential work of building a shelter for two souls against the cold, indifferent universe. One piece of firewood, one shared silence, one endured hardship at a time. Their love is the love that built the world, not with fanfares and declarations, but with the quiet, relentless, world-altering power of a seed pushing toward the sun. It is the love that whispers, in the very fact of our continued existence, we prevailed, not through glory, but through grace. And in that grace, we found everything.